This morning, I want to talk some about the history of adoption in the United States. For some, like me, adoption is part of our personal story. Looking into the well-intended and flawed history of adoption can help us better understand our own history. This isn't just for us, though. The story of hard decisions made out of even harder circumstances and the gap between intentions and impacts arises in each of our lives. Right now, parents of school-aged children face the daunting choice to keep children at home for school or sending them to learn in person with classmates. We know the intentions are good. It will take some time before we fully understand the impact of those difficult decisions, though. The gap between intention and impact is also striking in conversations about anti-racism and dismantling white supremacy. From time to time, white people do or say things that are unconsciously racist or just hurtful, even when it didn't mean to be. White people are encouraged to observe the gap between our intention and the actual impact of our words and actions. It sounds really simple, but setting aside defending our intentions long enough to see the impact of our actions can be a strangely hard challenge. In these difficult conversations about parenting in a pandemic, about racism, about adoption, I want to invite us into a spirit of deep curiosity and a little bit of grace. We often think about curiosity as a willingness to look up a new word or to watch a documentary now and then, maybe even learn a new language. That kind of curiosity is helpful for intellectual growth, and it runs deep in Unitarian Universalism. But there's a deeper kind of curiosity that can nurture our spiritual and emotional growth. When we're deeply curious about the world, when we want to understand why and how things have happened, we have to momentarily set aside judgment and evaluation. Deep curiosity isn't for the faint of heart. It often puts us face to face with disturbing realities. But deep curiosity, that kind that can momentarily set aside judgment, allows us to actually learn from the past and to grow toward a better future. Grace is a little bit more complicated. When I speak of grace today, I mean holding on to the truth gently as we learn from it. If it actually is truth, it contains a lot of its own power. It need not be used to clobber our neighbors or ourselves. I'm not talking about forgiveness, just gentleness. I'm inviting us to be deeply curious and to hold our truth gently, because curiosity without grace can very quickly sour. So there have always been, and there will always be, parents who are not able to care for their children, and children who need a home. The answer to that challenge looks different depending on the time and the place. In the United States, something called placing out was the precursor to adoption. In the mid-1800s, along with the Industrial Revolution and large waves of immigration, American cities grew way too fast. Poverty, exploitation of workers, high population density, unsanitary conditions, and a complete lack of planning made these cities incredibly dangerous. And in that dangerous environment, an unprecedented number of children needed care. Their parents were either deceased or, because of the worker exploitation, were working night and day and had nothing left to show for it. You might remember the story of Oliver Twist. Now, America didn't have those infamous workhouses of England. The story tells of the same grinding poverty and crime and danger that was a daily reality for urban children in the mid-1800s. Oliver Twist was written in 1837. Incidentally, Charles Dickens became a Unitarian 3 years later. But back to the United States. In New York, a Congregationalist minister named Charles Loring Brace took notice of this huge number of unattended children, and with a handful of other ministers, they created the Children's Aid Society. It provided safe accommodations and opportunities for education. This was a huge step forward. But institutions couldn't keep pace with the need, and there was a reasonable belief that children don't really thrive in an institution. They need families. As the number of children grew, the need for labor grew in rural settings. And out of that challenge emerged orphan trains. You heard that correctly, orphan trains. With the intention of providing homes in bucolic Western environments, the Aid Society sent these children on trains to towns across the West. Between 1854 and 1930, 200,000 children were transported from eastern cities to the rural West. When the trains arrived, these kids were dressed in new clothes and each given a new Bible. Some of the children had already been paired with families who had essentially ordered them based on gender, age, or physical characteristics. When placing in children with families, the reasons had as much to do with labor as they did with love. Boys were in demand for farm work, whereas household services like cleaning and cooking and childcare drove requests for girls. The children who didn't have arrangements before an arrival were taken to a local meeting place. They stood on a platform or a stage, and children had their muscles poked at and their teeth counted. Some of them sang and danced to attract attention. This process of putting kids on display for selection is the source of that term that we've all heard, put up for adoption. The orphan trains also had an anti-immigrant undertone. A lot of these kids' birth parents were Catholic, Irish, and Italian immigrants. The orphan trains essentially served to separate kids from their Catholic backgrounds, placing them with Protestant families. It was believed then that these families would culturally assimilate the children and improve their character. When the options are limited, it can be very difficult to define success. According to a 1910 survey of the Children's Aid Society, they determined that about 87% of the orphan train kids had done well. 13% did not. Incidentally, 2 of those boys became governors of their states. A couple of pieces of conventional wisdom come to mind looking at this moment in history. Don't judge a person until you walk a mile in their shoes, and hindsight is 20/20. There was no great answer to the problem of children in urban poverty. By today's standards, orphan train method is unimaginable. But it's our history, our truth to carry with a little bit of grace. These stories aren't easy to talk about. Adoption remains a heavily veiled piece of American culture, even today. I've come to realize that secrecy is no accident. Beginning in the 1900s, placing out was replaced with adoption. Rather than families taking in a child in exchange for some work around the house, families were expected to fully bring a child into their own family. The start of that legal adoption happened in 1852 with a Massachusetts Act to provide for child adoption. The law, that one law, set the precedence of a state by state, not a federal set of rules. And that state by state patchwork has garnered a whole lot of confusion. In 1917, Minnesota created a law mandating investigations, later known as home studies, that still happen, fortunately. The law also formalized the confidentiality of all adoption records. So by 1929, all states had developed laws about adoption. And by 1930, all states had sealed adoption records. What does that mean? This means that original birth certificates were literally locked away by the state. Adoptive families were given only an amended birth certificate. In many states today, adult adoptees are not allowed to access the legal document that records their own birth. When these laws were written, they were designed to protect the adoptive family from exposure or embarrassment regarding the origins of the adoptee. Also, it intentionally preserved the ability for adoptive parents to withhold from their adoptee child the story of their own origin. Contrary to what many believe, the laws were not created to protect the identity of birth parents. Now, this ethos of secrecy was paired with an emphasis on matching, which is pretty fascinating. Between 1900 and 1970, they went through great lengths to match adoptees with families into which they could blend seamlessly. At the simplest terms, that meant physical characteristics. In odder attempts, matching included class and presumptions about the IQ of the families and the adoptees themselves. Matching also applied to religious identity. The religious protection statutes required that children be placed with parents who practiced the same religion as their birth parents. This was actually a huge improvement for Jewish and Catholic communities that felt like they were being taken advantage of. The culture of camouflage continued until adoption went almost completely underground by the end of World War II, as American families embraced cookie cutter homes and families with the number of children that everyone should have. The 1960s brought a wave of cultural change with transracial adoption and international adoption and foster care that exploded that idea of matching. But the legacy of 70 years of intentional secrecy lingers. We don't know exactly how many adoptees there are in the United States, but the best research tells us there are about 7 million living in the United States. That's more than the population of Los Angeles and Chicago combined. There are 7 million adoptees, and consider each of those has birth parents and adoptive parents. We're talking about a massive number of people involved. And still, it's a private, somewhat uncomfortable thing to talk about publicly. I believe that most people do their best most of the time. I believe that the complicated patchwork of laws that define adoption were created with good intentions. The result of so many decades of secrecy, though, has been shame and ignorance about an institution that shapes millions and millions of lives. I don't have time to talk about the most recent 50 years of adoption. You probably don't want to hear it. And in many ways, you don't need to, because the pieces are the same. I don't mean the trains or the secrecy or the particular methods. I mean that well-intentioned people doing what they can to make the best out of a bad situation with no obvious answer. It seems that for the things that matter most in life, there's not a roadmap. That's why curiosity and grace are essential. My hope is that when we meet adoption and racism and the challenges of raising kids and all those other really tough spots that we find ourselves in, I hope we meet them with deep curiosity. I hope that with a little bit of grace, that we can set aside the judgment long enough to see the real impacts of the story. Because no matter how much we try to deny it, we are all in this together.